Hi, I'm Katie Keech. I am an LMFT and I also have lived experience with dissociative identities and ADHD. And I'm wearing a black shirt with a little bit of a green kitty and,
Oh,
and a silver necklace. I have a sort of dark gray hair that's tied back. And I am excited to be on this panel because I don't think we've ever had a panel where we've had a bunch of folks who are working in mental health in different capacities who also have lived experiences speaking about how we're talked about by folks who study dissociative identities or plurality. And I really was excited to see what everybody would have to say to just discuss this topic together. End there and pass it to, I'm going to pass it to Melissa Barsotti.
Hey there, my name is Melissa Barsotti, and I'm an LCSW. I am a Mexican-American female with brown skin, and currently I'm wearing a green shirt and hair's in a bun and got some big glasses on. And it's an honor to be on this panel. Everyone here is so amazing and has done so much written books and just really advocated for our community. I'm new to the community. It just in the last 5 years, looking back to the last 15 years that I've been in therapy, that the realities that I do have a system and just learning as I go along, and happy to be here, with my lived experience, my cultural experience, and yeah, just looking forward to changing the way that plurality is looked at by professionals and treated.
And Michelle Kahl.
Hi all, my name is Michelle Kahl, and I have blonde hair and I have glasses on currently, button-down shirt with pastel colors, white, pink and blue, a little bit of yellow in there. I'm a therapist and have been in this field for about 30 years, and even though I have all of that, I am only new to my system for about the last year. Although now that I look back on everything, it all makes sense. So just super, super happy to be here and looking forward to offering what I can and listening to all of my friends here and hoping to have some type of positive benefit that we can give the world for healing.
And Dr. Jamie Marich.
Hi, everyone. We're Dr. Jamie Marich. Professionally, we're the author of Dissociation Made Simple and a longtime EMDR trainer and professional clinical counselor. Personally, we are the Unicorn System, which is the name that was revealed to us just this past year. We also use stylized as Jamie Plus sometimes. And we are a fuller figured woman with a bit of a chubby face. We have highlighted blonde hair, blue eyes, fair skin. We're wearing rainbow earrings, a hot pink top, and a shawl that is aqua and purple. And we're sitting in our office near Akron, Ohio, which is on Erie Nation land. And this is our office where there's a bookshelf behind us with all kinds of tchotchkes and figurines and things that mean a lot to us in our system. Thanks, Katie, for having us. I look forward to the discussion.
And Crystals.
Hi, I'm Crystals. Sometimes I use my last name Lockman, or sometimes I use the name Multifaceted in the community. I am trained as a clinician, but took a turn and started Multifaceted Journeys, where I work from my lived experience, doing groups and consultations for therapists. And what else? Oh, image description. I have a light skin, brownish blonde hair, and I'm wearing a kind of interesting patterned blue and greenish shirt. I have some flowers in the background. And I'm excited to be on this panel. I think it's an important subject that can be a little bit divisive in various communities. So I think it's nice that we're all coming together and talking about it. And thank you for having me.
And Dr. Adrian Fletcher.
Hi, I'm Dr. Adrian Fletcher, but known by the DID community as the Adrian and Co system. I am trained as a clinical psychologist. I've worked in mental health for over 23 years. I stopped my private practice in December of 2023 just to focus more on speaking and advocacy and education. I started a new business last year called Altercology, kind of merging the idea that psychology can be different and also use the term alters just because that's what my parts came up with. So we're still in the process of the building Altercology, but we offer mentorship programs, and we're also the authors of One Soul, Multiple Expressions, which is a little poetry book put out by my parts. And we're working on a book for New Harbinger Publications, an experiential toolbox for people living with dissociation and DID to be able to help their parts, their system, and their parts at home. And hopefully that will be published in 2025. I'm really excited to be here. It's been really hard to be inside the field of mental health. I feel like I'm a disruptor, and it just wasn't serving my soul in the same way. So I still like to serve the mental health community, but in a way that makes more sense for me and my parts now. And I'm really excited to be here amongst all of you and just to have a heartfelt, authentic discussion of what both worlds have been like clinically and from the lived experience standpoint. I feel like I've learned more about lived experience by spending more time in the community versus any time I've ever spent in mental health. Thank you for having me and asking me to be a part of the panel too.
Thanks for being a part. No pun intended, sorry. Melissa Parker.
We're the Melissas. We are in Arlington, Massachusetts, the traditional unceded land of the Massachusetts people. We are LMHC psychotherapists, or therapy, as we call ourselves, the plural of therapist. We are, let's see, we have brown hair that has pink streaks in it, and we have light skin with freckles and glasses. And we're wearing a blue shirt, and we are sitting in our kind of messy therapy office. And we're just really happy to be here and be in conversation with everybody. And we're here to share what we know and to learn what other people know. So very happy to be here. Thank you.
Thanks. And Dr. Anna Rosenhauer.
Hi, I'm Anna Rosenhauer. I'm a postdoctoral researcher. My background is in psychology and neuroscience, and I'm currently a postdoc in the psychiatry and behavioral neurosciences department. And I study how the brain responds to trauma and stress and PTSD, and how that impacts future behavior, particularly, as well as future generations. And I'm really excited to bring both my professional and lived experience to the panel. I am pale-skinned with light brown hair that's curly and short, just above the shoulders. And I have a dark gray sweater with little silver specks on it. And I have a silver double ring necklace on, and I am in front of a white curtain in a big black chair in my home.
Do you mind if I say something real quick?
Oh, go for it.
Y'all might see me kind of yawning or struggling with my breath a lot, and that sadly, unfortunately happens with the social anxiety that I tend to have, but I'm okay, and I'm not tired, and I'm not bored, and I'm attentive.
Great. So the first question, yeah, we didn't think you were bored. Maybe, it's okay to be tired. How do you, as a mental health professional or peer, define functional multiplicity is our first question.
Well, I just want to name that I realize the phrase functional multiplicity is what is in vogue right now in the field / our community. We don't really like the word functional. We've had some colleagues ask us to consider if the word functional is really much an ableist term, because I'm functional in some areas of our life and can feel very dysfunctional in other areas of our life. So I just feel the need to get that out there as somebody who has a love-hate relationship with the word functional. But we've long used the idea of having a working wholeness or collaboration or cooperation or collective. So a big part of my work is emphasizing whatever language works for you and you use in your system, honor that. But I would say, if we're assuming, how would you define functional multiplicity? It's this idea that you can still be well, you can still live a beautiful, adaptive life and have your parts in your system, your alters intact, because so long our field has operated under this myth that you have to integrate in order to get better and be normal. And we hate the word normal even more than functional. So yeah, it's this idea that our parts can exist with each other and we can live a beautiful working whole life.
Thanks for that. I think part of why we put the question up was also to kind of take apart the clinical wording of the term. So I appreciate you adding into it.
I'd like to go next. This is Michelle Kahl. When I think of that phrase, what often comes to mind is my love of music. And I think of it first in terms of each of my parts are like an instrument, each in an individual of themselves. And whenever they can work together, it's the formation of music or formation of an orchestra. And so when I look at functional multiplicity, I too, Jamie, I don't like that word. It's like, what is functional? I think it's subjective and it kind of irritates me a little bit. But what I notice is that when all of my parts can work together, wonderful things can happen. And it's incredible. And just over the last year of getting to know that and getting to understand that, it's been super helpful because I find that I can draw on each one given the different circumstances that's needed. I have a badass team that can get stuff done that maybe normally my littles would be terrified, or even myself as an adult would be terrified to do. So it's pretty incredible. So essentially, it's when a system, and that's how I refer to it, when we learn to work together and there's harmony. So going back to the music, that's kind of how I see it.
Thanks for that.
You can speak to this too. For us, it's when there's room for everybody in the system to be a part of the life and to do things that are personally meaningful to each of us as people. We define as people, not necessarily so much as parts. So when all of our people have their thing and their place and their connection to the life and to one another.
Could say something. This is Crystals. I think a big thought that I have about this is taking the term disorder away from the idea of multiplicity. That when you say dissociative identity disorder is often equated, multiplicity is equated with a disorder. And I think the term that you're going for, functional multiplicity, kind of separates out like what is problematic for the system and what is a way that they are able to have a life that they want in the world. And I think that that's kind of the distinction that I see as a way to be like, okay, we can have a disorder that is in some ways needed for insurance and different ways of conceptualizing things, but that doesn't have to be the definingness of whether or not someone is healthy.
Yeah, I definitely agree with the whole functioning terms that it's problematic. I mean, as I've been looking at it with different things, especially with people that I work with and then myself, like looking at terms such as high functioning and low functioning really don't fit and are very ableist in terms of like some folks I have been referred to my practice and I have had them referred to my practice as, well, this is a very low trajectory healing multiple, person with DID, and have found that I mean, obviously I don't think that way, but like, it's people struggle and then people can get some support and then have different areas of their life where they excel and then have other areas of their life simultaneously where they crash. And I do the same thing myself. So it's especially with plurality, like we can overfunction and underfunction at the same time. And I don't think that that's really looked at very well. And I don't think that it helps to split those kinds of functionings into like good or bad or higher or lower. Then you're missing things. And then you're also not really giving the supports in different areas that a person might need them. If you're looking at how they're doing so well, you might not see or give supports where a person's struggling and vice versa. So, and even with concepts like healthy multiplicity, I think the concept of having everybody interblending in a certain specific way is also a little bit ableist in terms of sometimes some systems still, as much of the work as they have had, still have amnesia, right? And that doesn't mean that they're not excelling in many areas and doing a lot of complicated things that would get, the check boxes marked in terms of how well they're doing. And some people with their, I don't know, it isn't really looking at a system as a whole complex system. It's sort of looking at, let's check the boxes for what we want in terms of what looks more blended and like a singlet. But does that really make the person or the system healthier or happier? I'm not really sure that they're always looking at that when they've defined these sorts of things. I think it's more complicated.
This is Melissa's again. We're also wondering why there's so much emphasis on functioning or on blending or on any of this. That in itself is kind of, well, it is ableist. It's sort of like we're being held to this really high standard that maybe doesn't apply to other people in other diagnostic categories or lack of diagnostic categories, that in order to be legitimate, we have to prove that we can function to a standard that's acceptable to singlets. And we do find that problematic both personally and in our work with other systems.
I can go. It's Dr. Adrian. Well, for the purpose of this, Adrian and company, I'm still having that identity crisis with the doctorate in front of my name. I use the term functional a lot, and I always beat myself up after I say it. It's like, I think I'm still healing or clearing up like the internalized stigma I have from having like worked in the field. I notice sometimes I still say functional or even normal sometimes, even when I'm doing interviews, and it just sort of flows out of me without even like it's not like I intend anything bad by it. I think when I think of functioning, I think of like my system functioning as a team, but I don't think about like what I'm like relaying on the outside, because I think people with DID are brilliant and can do just fine with different areas of their life. And I think it was Dr. Jamie who said something about I don't know exactly how you said it, but like thriving in one area, but maybe not so in the other, or dysfunctional in other areas. And I mean, there's definitely times where my system gets rattled and I wouldn't necessarily feel like I'm checking a box of some kind. But yeah, I think for me, it's like learning new language, even that fits for my own system and how I, communicate to the rest of the even with advocacy stuff, since we're all so different, and then moving away from those more clinical rigid terms that have been ingrained in us for so long. So yeah, so I think that's just my take on it. I think there's a better way to talk about how we kind of operate out in the world, and that I love the terms like active or even thriving. And I agree with what Melissa said about like, I think there is some overarching pressure, I think, when we're under the microscope to like prove somehow that we're, I don't know, meeting the societal expectations of like a singlet or whatever, a singleton. So yeah, lots to still unpack there for me, just on both those terms. And they do come out of my mouth quite a bit. So I gotta work on that for all of us, not just for my system.
Yeah, this is Anna. I love what you guys have shared. For the for first thing, I think it's really great that we have a term out there that can be used to, like Crystal said, to kind of separate out dissociative identity disorder from the state of plurality. And I think that's really important, particularly in the research and academic field in this area, because there's a very narrow view of DID and plurality and what constitutes a life that is well lived with those conditions. And so I think on the one hand, that's great, but also is a very low bar to set for sure. And I agree, like the word functional has like, to me, it's kind of like the word adaptive or resilient. Like, okay, well, something that's functional in one context is very non-functional in another. Like, I mean, what I'm doing if I'm in front of a classroom of college students versus what I'm doing when I go out to happy hour with my coworkers. One thing can be very adaptive and take it out of that context and put it into another. And it's very like unadaptive or unhelpful. So I do tend to go more with the terms helpful or harmful and those sorts of things because it just seems like a better descriptor. And I do wish we had a better descriptor of what it is to live a life worth living with plurality, with multiplicity.
I'd like to jump in there. And Katie, I don't know if this is encroaching onto a next question or another question, but we have really loved taking on the identifier. We're Jamie, we're a person, or sometimes we say a system with dissociative identities. And Dr. Adrian, I really have to give you credit for bringing that phrase mostly into our awareness, because I think you started referring to yourself as that online. At least you're one of the first ones we remember seeing, like person with dissociative identities. And that really falls into a lot of the person first language that is informing a lot of other advocacy movements. Like instead of saying, I'm an addict, I'm a person with a substance use disorder or issue. And the reason I like saying I'm a person with dissociative identities, it highlights that this is just the way our mind is in the world. Take the disorder off of it. Person with dissociative identities, person with multiplicity. And the other reason I really like that identifier is I think it brings those of us who are officially diagnosed OSDD and those of us who may be officially diagnosed as DID into some kind of commonality. Because as an OSDD system, I relate more to what people with DID experience than folks with any other mental health diagnosis. There's a lot I have in common. And I know there are going to be future questions coming up about kind of some of the differences between OSDD and DID, but our minds are very similar to our siblings here who formerly have or had a DID diagnosis. So that's a phrase we're really liking. We're a system, or we're a person with dissociative identities.
Yeah, I was just going to jump on that in terms of I don't personally like, this is Katie, there's sort of almost like a hierarchy of OSDD is better than DID, and people, sometimes when they're trying to come out, say that they're OSDD, and then there's like I think I've even heard somebody say, well, maybe, like it was a clinician who was singlet, said maybe OSDD folks are more resilient than folks who have DID, and I super bristled at that. And as somebody, who had been diagnosed as originally DDNOS and OSDD, and as I've gotten to know my system better, have realized I am polyfragmented, but that looks more like OSDD. And becoming more acquainted with my system has created more amnesia gaps. So then I have more complicated issues, but that's actually me learning my system and getting more collaboration with what's happening, because the flowing in and out was more hiding rather than what looked to professionals like functional multiplicity. And I don't think clinicians who don't have lived experience understand that.
Yeah, I think that it's important sometimes if we're talking about plurality or multiplicity, that we remember that these are relationships internally as well. And so there's a lot of different ways that relationships can be helpful, harmful, adaptive, non-adaptive, functional, non-functional. And we see this internally, or at least I can speak for my system, we see this internally with all kinds of different relationships, some of which can be really problematic and some of which are super life affirming and amazing. And being able to look at like, okay, what's going on with a system relationally? Like, are they, like Michelle, like you were saying, are they living in harmony? Is there, like you were saying, Melissa, are people getting a chance to live their life and have a say in their life and have time in their life? Like these sorts of things that we might even look at if we were looking at like a group of outside people and how they relate and how an organization might even function in some ways, and say, oh, how, is this organization functional or non-functional? Well, most of them are non-functional because we're in capitalism, but like, a group of individuals working together towards a common goal. We see this externally all the time, and we have ways of looking and thinking about it. But also, when we look at it that way, we realize how complicated it can be and how differently that can look for every single group of people. And I think that's what we've found just becoming more involved in the plural community, as far as seeing like, oh, wow, there is so many options. And when you think that you've figured out all the options, know that you haven't, because you will meet somebody then that completely blows your mind.
Is it okay to go to the next question? Does anybody have anything to kind of top this off? Okay, let me go to the next question. So question number 2 is, many clinical experts in the field of dissociation, and this is Katie speaking, have the belief that DID primarily arises not just from trauma, but specifically from torture. What are your thoughts on this concept?
This is Melissa, not Melissa's, Melissa Barsotti. I know this to not be true. I think not enough is written about traumas of omission, neglect, emotional neglect, and just the heaviness of emotions and experiences being carried alone by a young child, teenager, even young adult without appropriate resources is so overwhelming to the system and to the nervous system. Not being seen for who you are, not being attuned to, just feeling alone. It can easily fragment, and all the things that you go through in this world that we live in education, going through these things alone, without support, without guidance, without nurturing, that's incredibly cruel, overwhelming, certainly, and not you is certainly going to fragment the system for survival.
This is Jamie. Sorry, I didn't ID myself the first two times. Yeah, I have a lot of strong feelings on many things, but I know, Katie, that this was one of the reasons I suggested we do this panel, because there is a lot of misinformation or myths out there about what even qualifies someone for a DID diagnosis. So 20 plus years ago, I was in graduate school, and I still remember hearing this, that DID, we were told, was so rare, you're hardly ever going to see it because there's only ever been a few hundred true cases of it. And to truly get DID, you have to have experienced abuse at the level of satanic ritual abuse or torture. Like, only that will qualify you for a DID, a true DID diagnosis. So I first want to validate that I know that type of abuse and torture exists. I am not negating that. And I realize what a horrible piece of information that was in terms of being relayed to us, because I've gone on to see, and I think for a lot of years, knowing the quote unquote level of our trauma, and even that implies hierarchy, which I'm sure could be another question here, like what is enough trauma? That overwhelms us to even think about. For a lot of years, because we were diagnosed still under the DDNOS system, and we had a lot of questions like, well, did we really have it that bad for this to be validated as such? And I mean, as a clinician, I've seen people with all different levels of traumatic experiences. Let me take the word levels out. I'm even checking my own language there. All different variations and varieties of traumatic experience potentially develop multiplicity. And if not multiplicity, then at very least, or take that's hierarchical language, or some level of dissociative response to cope with trauma, neglect, even stress, or, like I'm sure others of you have to share on this, what it's like being somebody who doesn't fit the norm of what's expected around you. That can also create the need to dissociate, trying to be that square peg in a round hole.
Hi, this is Melissa's. This question, I think I remember it might have come up from a LinkedIn post, right? That there was somebody who was asserting on LinkedIn that the only way you really got DID or something to that effect is through torture. And when we saw that, it made us actually really kind of scared. It was another one of those situations where we realized that a lot of people really don't understand dissociation or trauma or dissociative responses or identities. That it's not just this big, huge, catastrophic event or life that could cause folks to, first of all, be plural, and then second of all, be a DI or an OS system. So I think just the fact that this is something that folks who, I believe this was a singlet who posed it, and I've heard variations of this question from various singlets, that there's really no understanding of us in the mainstream if this is something in 2024 that's still being asked. And that's no insult to anybody. It's just our genuine reaction.
Yeah, this comment just really to me drives home that we have a major problem of representation when it comes to plurality, and that this becomes especially problematic within the clinical and the academic and research world. But in addition, also simply in society, and I'll leave that one for another time and another presentation. But we're seeing, as far as like clinical academic research presentation, you see a very narrow view of plurality, specifically as OSDD versus DID. And you see it with a very high level of trauma being emphasized as part of its etiology and as part of almost a prerequisite. And a lot of times I think that people can kind of like corner themselves into their own theories and hypotheses, because when there's something that involves a lot of controversy, because you tend to become more extreme in your position in response to controversy, and that defensiveness comes in. And so I think that some of this, like really strong emphasis on it, is coming from an intention to really protect those who are highly vulnerable because of highly traumatic experiences. But unfortunately, a side effect of that is that we can get into this, what I call always, only, never thinking, where it's like, okay, well, we often see in our research, which is a very specific population of individuals with plurality, because the sampling is just not able to be done at a wider range. And even when it is able to be done, it's not being done, and it's not being funded in order to be done. But what we see then is that, okay, we have trauma and dissociation go together. Okay, great. So trauma and dissociation go together. That's really all that tells us. And it doesn't tell us that it only goes together. It doesn't tell us that it always goes together. It just tells us that it goes together. And given the lack of research into plurality in general, particularly outside the higher levels of clinical care, I think that anything that says always, only, or ever is very, very premature and unfounded scientifically.
This is Crystals. I can say something about this. First of all, I just want to say this question is one of the major reasons why I'm a little nervous about this panel, because I know that it can be a big divisive question, not only in the clinical community, but also in the lived experience community, as far as dividing like DID from other forms of plurality. And I don't know how much you want to say about how I've seen the fallout from that. But I also want to bring the view that for me, when I was diagnosed with DID, the validation that came from the diagnosis, as in it validated the level of trauma that I had, was extremely useful, because I had a really hard time, and still do, at seeing the level of trauma that I have and wanting to minimize that. And so I think some of my experience has been wanting to hold on to that DID equals severe trauma, because I needed that to validate my experience, because I didn't have the memories, and I didn't have I didn't have any external factors, like police or anybody else in my life who even noticed it at all. So the DID diagnosis was something that I really needed to validate my experience for me to move forward in my healing. And I think that that's the case for a lot of people who hold on to this. And I also think it is problematic in just some of the ways that it comes out, some of the ways that it has become divisive. And I think that comparing trauma is problematic, because we don't always know how something impacts somebody else. And when I hear somebody's story and I start comparing it to mine, I downplay one of them. I either downplay their story or I downplay my story, and neither of them is going to be useful. And I come out of being fully present with the person and their experience. And when I start doing that, I know that there is a lot of times I'm not holding my own experience as valid, or something's missing in my life. Like I'm not having a compassion for myself somewhere, I'm not resourced, or something's going on in myself that I'm not in a place where I'm able to hold their experience without either downplaying mine or downplaying theirs. And the other thing is, I think that systems do what they need to do in order to get through a situation, and that vastly varies body to body, person to person, mind to mind. Like some people are gonna have different forms of multiplicity or different ways that it expressed based on what is needed for them, or even like sometimes what is wanted, or different things around that. So thank you for putting this together and for that question.
I find my system right now is acting up, and everybody wants to chime in. Is this question is what I'm noticing. And so, Crystals, I have to say that a lot of us relate to what you said. I guess looking at this, it's a both and for me right now. As a therapist and working with my clients, it's you have complex trauma. Let's talk about what trauma is. Trauma is a wound. Trauma is a wound, and what happens as a result of that is we have different experiences as individuals. We each have our own experience with that. We each have our own experience with the support or lack thereof. And when we take back and put the onus of responsibility, we have to look at it's a developmental wound, meaning it is coming back from what we didn't receive, not just what happened to us, but what we didn't get when these things first happened to us. So that's my therapist view. And then my system, all my parts right now want to chime in, and somebody saying, like, it's, let them know that it's not about levels and it's not about keeping score, because we've never felt like we fit in. And to further categorize and put somebody in a box is really not okay. We all have experiences, just like people who are singlets or singletons, they have their own experiences. And so to say, well, you have to have this, this, and this to fit this box, I don't buy it. I don't buy it. And I'm also not okay with it. It's what I'm noticing. I think the thing is to remind ourselves that it's not just what happened to us, it's what we didn't get. And then how we make sense of that, and how we heal, and how we process through our journey, and all of that. That's basically where I stand with it all. So again, both and mosaic answer here, but that's just what I notice coming up in me right now.
I can weigh in a little bit, although it really makes me nervous because I hear the word torture and I just sort of check out. I think for me, it kind of reminds me of a Brene Brown thing where she talked about, like, we're not to assume somebody else's experiences, and to really just honor what each person is sharing, whether that's somebody with OSDD, DID, or a singlet, right? Like, we all have our own experiences. So I would never say that, somebody isn't presenting the way that I think they should present. Like, that just doesn't fit for me. I think each person has their own way of experiencing things. I think where I get stuck on the torture and the ritual abuse and the trafficking that I've experienced is sometimes I do feel alone in that world when I'm trying to speak up for that, because it's so controversial in itself, right? People already don't believe that, and then they don't believe the DID. And so for me, it feels very much alone out there, even though I know I'm not. Like, other people have obviously experienced those things. And so my nervous system and my parts are activated right now, because it's been such a hard journey for us in that realm, speaking to those things. And then on the other hand, I'm very much with Crystals about, we don't compare trauma, and we don't need to put ourselves in those boxes. And if, people have different experiences of plurality, then all experiences are valid, because that's what people are sharing as their experience. So, and then again, I just think about the field and how the field has created some of that divisiveness about what things should and should not look like. And I think all of us are trying to unpack a lot of that, or undo a lot of that by sharing our own journeys and our own stories. And even by doing that collectively, right, there's some commonalities and some differences. So, and I'm always open to learning. It reminds me of graduate school when we were learning about, we had an additional, I don't want to say manual, but that probably is what it was, but on different cultural experiences. And I remember being so intrigued by that, because I feel like DID and even the DID community or plural community is like its very own culture in a way. And I don't think we're talking about that enough inside mental health. And I think that's where some of the clinicians and the researchers are missing it, because they're actually not spending time with so many different systems with different experiences to kind of capture the culture that is our community. I don't know if I'm making sense here, because I know I started off overwhelmed, but just trying to be genuine with where I think this can get really dicey, and I don't think it needs to be. I think it's just like an openness to hearing about each system or each person's experiences and why they feel the way they feel about certain things.
I appreciate that. This is Katie speaking. I know that the term is pretty intense, and I had thought about it when I was talking with Jamie in terms of the stuff. When I first started out, I was very steeped in the establishment mindset of what is and what isn't, and I feel sometimes like I discounted some people who I do think had plurality, but I was checking those boxes that I was taught to check in terms of, is it the right kind of trauma? Is it early enough? Does it check the correct boxes in terms of what would make or break somebody having plurality? And especially having delved into neurodivergence of different sorts more, it's very much helped me understand that just being in a body and a psyche that doesn't quite fit in the world as the world is built for a certain type of brain, because we like to streamline things. And my personal viewpoint is that's to make things a little more fascistically easy to control people if we don't accept a variety of brains. That in itself is traumatic. And I think that can in and of itself be enough. And it's been interesting. I myself have the check marks as boxes checkmarked for torture. I don't like that term. I think it's voyeuristic in terms of looking at different impacts of trauma. And so I see it in the literature and I see it out of clinicians. I remember connecting with somebody who is very prominent in the field, and eventually, because we were doing somatic experientials, having to disclose I had plurality, and them saying that this other person I knew and myself, that they themselves had trauma, but I had been tortured, and without knowing anything about my history. And I was really offended. I was offended about the voyeuristic nature and the way that a specific trauma would be labeled special. And I know that there are different impacts of trauma with, chaotic trauma. It can create sort of one thing, and then with very intentional trauma, it can create another thing, which, I have experience where you have very intentional impacts, which have very intentional effects, right? When you're a little kid, that are intended, but the deepest wounds of those intentional traumas, which I think that the clinical world is speaking to, was more the attachment pieces, not the pain in and of itself, not the fear. It was the attachment, which was the most brutal aspect. And that resonates throughout our populations, right? It's intentionally exploited, but that is in of itself enough, right? If you're going to go for enough, that is in and of itself enough to create such pain in a small child, regardless of all of the other things. Why do we reify something that's in a specific context or it has a specific impact, when we all know attachment is the most brutal thing a little kid can experience, beyond direct threats to life or death?
Hey everyone, this is Jamie. So if you followed my work before, you may know that I am a big language nerd, because I started as an English teacher before I got into the human services. And I will link it in ICM's booth here for Plural Positivity. I did a TEDx talk back in 2015 on the trauma as wound concept, because the English word for trauma comes from the Greek word meaning wound. And I think unpacking that and exploring that helps us to see that wounds can come in various shapes and sizes. Wounds can have different qualitative types of impact on the individual, depending on the individual's neurobiology, depending on their individual's nutrition, whether they're immunocompromised or not. There's just so many factors that go into it. And one of the points I make in that talk is how wounds that get addressed and get the treatment that they need can go on and not be a big deal. But so much of what we've dealt with, I think, as a group in our lives, what we see in our clients is that these wounds were just left to fester and infect. And that's what can cause complications. So in that spirit, I looked up the word torture, the word origin of the word torture in English, because again, I tell people, look it up in your language too, to see if it gives you any kind of further insight. First recorded in 1530 to 1540, comes from the Latin word meaning a twisting or a torment. I'm going to sit with that. I'm going to journal in that a little bit, because I think there's something about what does it mean for my reality, my experience of life to get twisted. And I think a lot of what kept us tripped up for a lot of years is our primary torture in our home was psychological and spiritual in nature. Very little was done to us physically. And for a lot of years, I thought that discounted us from having the right to take up space in these kind of places. And even that was something my primary abuser used as a manipulative device. You don't know how good you have it. You're getting fed. You have a steady place to sleep. I'm not putting my hand on you. But they very much did that with our mental processes. And my first person who worked as a sponsor for me and got me into this recovery path, I always remember what she said, because I was using a lot of these protests with her when she started saying that I had trauma. No, but we never survived a war. We never did this. We never did that. We never experienced this, whatever. And then she just responded so calmly, because we were working in a war zone at the time in humanitarian aid. That was the other color on the story. And she said, Jamie, maybe the war zone was your house. Would you consider that? Would you consider that a lot of what you traditionally know to be trauma at that point, you just experienced it in different ways? And so she really encouraged me to look at the impact of it, which is what fundamentally helped me to get ourselves on a road to some kind of wellness here.
This is Melissa's again. I think some of the issue that we're dealing with is that we are working in a framework that's not organically ours. Is that this is based on the languaging, the conceptualization, the enactment of a lot of these therapies, a lot of these ideas, a lot of these theories are based on singlet versions of thinking about who we are and what we've experienced and how we came to be, not really who we are. And as we're all talking, and I'm hearing all of our internalized ism, right? All of the stuff that we don't even realize maybe until there's a group of us sitting together like we are today, how deep it goes and how much of this we've actually accepted without even wanting to accept it or realizing we're accepting it. So we're just really grateful to be here today and be in conversation with y'all, because this is what's going to help turn that around, I think.
This is Michelle again. Just to kind of add on to this, Jamie, I really appreciate you looking up that word, because just saying that and hearing the definition of twisting, that's my whole life. It was my whole life. And I can remember last July, I was meeting with my therapist and said, look, I just need to know, what am I dealing with? And she kept saying, you have complex trauma. And I'm like, of course I do, but what am I dealing with? And when she finally asked, she said, do you have amnesia? You have some memory gaps. And I'm like, yeah, I guess I kind of do. Okay, so we're dealing with the DID. I'm like, okay, I moved right along. It's like, okay, but it was validating in some ways to like realize that, okay, so what I have been dealing with, there's a legitimacy there. So I guess in essence, in terms of a framework, okay, there was this. It didn't qualify or quantify what I experienced though. This does, this twisting, saying that there was a torture or a twisting there, that was my whole life. Everything that I had learned and everything I come to believe, I realized as an adult, it was not true. And that's pretty twisted, isn't it? So yeah, there we go. I mean, there's how things happen, I think Jamie's heard this from me before, but I kind of explain growing up in a dysfunctional family as being given one crayon. And essentially it's a purple crayon that you're given. And this is how you make your meaning of your life. and your parents and everybody that are around you as a kid tell you that this is what everything looks like, this is what you're supposed to use, this is supposed to be the thing that you use to solve problems, and so that's all you know. And then you get to school and you get to experience things with other kids and you realize, well, they've got more than just one crayon. What's wrong with me? You know? And then you get out in the real world and you realize that other people have a 12-pack of crayons, or a 24-pack of crayons, or a 64-pack, or 128-pack of crayons. And you realize that, well, Jesus, wasn't fair. This is all I got. So the cool thing is that now it's up to me to pick the colors that I want in my box of crayons. And that's essentially where healing comes into play, is that I can decide for myself what I need, and I can give myself the things that maybe I didn't get. And so now today I have a bigger box of crayons than what I started out with in the